time. The first thing I'd like to do is just acknowledge that a person who's been a key part of the sort of sewer projects and things in this town, Jerry Patamas, passed away
Oh, no.
suddenly last weekend.
Wow.
He served the town well over the years. He was always a good source to go to for knowledge and information. He started out working at the EPA on some much bigger projects, and he'll be sorely missed. So, here's to Jerry.
Jerry was a veteran. Most people don't know this. He was a veteran of 3 wars.
Yeah.
Colonel, he was a colonel.
Yeah, he was a colonel. He was a veteran of 3 wars.
He got up at
Okay.
town meeting to speak. Wow.
Yep. All right, so the first item on here, John, is yours. A little update on where we are with looking at the Title V septic tax credit.
Okay, so continuing on the theme of where's the money going to come from, I think most of the folks here are aware that we've been working with the state representative and state senator to push forward a bill that will change the Title V septic tax credit from non-refundable to refundable. And just a brief status report on where we're at. Page down. Okay. So I think we owe really a deep level of gratitude to Representative David Vieira, because he's pushed through, the first bill on this, and it's titled "An Act Relative to a Refundable Title V Septic Tax Credit." And he's taken the concept that we've been pushing to make this a more widely applicable credit by having it not tied to how much money you owe the state in taxes, but I've had the expense and I can claim the credit regardless of what I owe the state in taxes. So he's actually added to this bill. The first part of the bill, which was submitted on the 16th and the language was added this past week, is a refundable tax credit that would go to primary homeowners whose principal residence is in Massachusetts and who can make a claim for work done to repair a septic system, to bring it up to best available nitrogen technology, or for the connection of a sewer to the sewer line. So it won't impact, it's not going to be something related to the betterment, but it will impact IA systems and connections made by homeowners to the sewer system. And he wants to make that a refundable tax credit. So it would go to people regardless, again, of what they owe in taxes to the state. Then, in addition, he's added a second part to that, which would be a non-refundable credit, which would go to secondary homeowners, people who own vacation homes, short-term rental homes, and they wouldn't qualify for the refundable credit because their home isn't their principal residence, but they could still apply for the non-refundable credit. So he's expanded this Title V septic credit to include both primary and secondary homeowners. So that's a big change from what existed on the books. And that's where we stand with that. Let me go down. And this is the language of the bill. They changed what's called the general law, Part 1, Title 9, Chapter 62, Section 6, under credits, subsection I. And the parts that are in red here are what he's changed. He's added, the key one is the tax credit shall be refundable to the taxpayer, and that's related to the primary homeowners. And then he's added a whole second paragraph titled I-1/2, which would relate to the non-refundable component for secondary homeowners. So he's taken a big step forward. We'll see where it all ends up. One thing I wanted to just show is that this is not a simple process, and sort of I've created a roadmap of how a bill becomes a law. And the legislative process starts in the odd number years in Massachusetts. So in the beginning of 2025, in the first couple of weeks, the proposed bills are submitted. And this bill, HD 2942, for the refundable septic tax credit, was submitted by Representative Vieira. It goes to a joint committee hearing When I talked to Representative Vieira, he said he was hoping he was going to try to steer it towards the Environment and Natural Resources Committee before it goes to the Ways and Means Committee, so that way it can gain some weight in terms of the importance of the bill relative to the environment, relative to the many homeowners who are impacted by it, before it just goes right to the people who make the money decisions. And from there, they could vote to not pass it, or a study order, which would kill the bill, basically, or ought to pass, and then it goes through a whole series of processes through the different branches of the legislation. And finally, it goes to a conference committee to align House and Senate on components of the bill to a single bill enactment, and then finally to the governor for hopefully signing. So it's a long process. This can take several years, but hopefully with the work that Representative Vieira is doing, and hopefully what this committee can do in terms of publicizing how important this is towards people, homeowners, paying for these very expensive nitrogen mitigation steps that are being required by the state, that we can provide some serious financial relief to people who have to undergo these expenses. Now, Senator Fernandez, in a previous meeting we had with him over Zoom, also mentioned that he wants to support a bill that would provide relief. His bill hasn't made it yet to, being submitted to the legislation, but in discussions with him and some of his aides, he's still talking about a bill that would have an upper income cap on eligibility. If you make X dollars, above that, you wouldn't be able to apply for this bill. We haven't seen what those numbers would be yet. He wants to keep the refundable credit basically revenue neutral, so by cutting off on the high end, there'd be more money, in theory, for the low end, and keep the eligibility to principal residents in Massachusetts. So his bill, if it does get submitted, would be very different than what Representative Vieira has submitted to date. But right now, only Representative Vieira has submitted a bill. And then lastly, I just want to close on, when you actually, as a taxpayer, look up how do I, enact this tax credit, well, they have a Form SC, and in 2024, the instructions have been expanded to include the regulations or the regulatory framework that's being initiated by the DEP with regards to the watershed permit. So if you are responding to a watershed permit and you're putting in an IA system or connecting to a sewer, then you will qualify for these tax credits. There's no doubt about that now. The language has been written in very clearly. So, for all the work we're doing in the 14 watersheds and the 4 watershed permits that are going to be discussed, I think, later today, they'll all be included in this. So those expenses will be qualifying expenses. So.
Thank you, Jonathan. A couple of quick comments, and I'll take them from the rest of the board. Number one, Doug Brown, one of our select board members, he reached out through the group that gets together about all the select boards on the Cape about this. They're all aware of it. There's been some positive feedback to David's office from multiple other communities. And in addition, David has, through the Cape delegation, has brought this issue up with the Cape delegation. So there's a little bit of, understanding of where this is at and the benefits in terms of the difficulty of getting from being told you gotta put an IA in and what it's gonna cost, to knowing that there's some relief in it that will encourage people to do it. So it's a first step, and if we don't get it this year, we'll come back next year or 2 years. Steve?
Could you go back to the first slide? That paragraph started with bold-faced refundable, I think is unfortunate grammar, because there are 2 different ways you can read it. One means, especially because it says whose principal residence is in Massachusetts. Well, obviously, if we're talking about houses in Falmouth, that residence is in Massachusetts. And so if that's their primary resident, or does this mean to cover people whose primary residence is in Worcester, but they own a second home in Falmouth?
No,
They're trying to get the
I
credit
think that's
for.
a second. If it's a secondary home that you're using this credit for, then under Vieira's bill, it would be a non-refundable. If it's your principal residence, as written in the actual language of the bill, then that would apply, you'd be able to apply for the refundable tax credit. So secondary means that it's not your principal, it's a home that you use for vacation purposes or for
That's
short-term
what I thought.
rentals.
And I know you're not responsible for this if it's an error. You are responsible for it if it's right. Just kidding. But, and who are we to criticize the legislatures who are probably have, 5 out of 6 of them are attorneys and so on, but there's a much clearer way to say that. It applies to somebody for whom this house is their primary residence.
Yeah,
Period.
when you go to Form SC for this tax credit, it lays out, who is eligible. And it states that if this is your principal residence in Massachusetts, then you would apply, you would be eligible for the credit. What Vieira has done is saying that even if it's not your principal residence, but it's a Massachusetts home, a secondary home, then you have the option to go for a non-refundable credit.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what the language he's written in this part here is basically saying. So it's probably not as clear as you'd like, but that's the way the legislature writes these paragraphs in their general laws. It's legalese to some extent, but it spells it out when you actually go to the forms and where you would apply the tax credit when filling out your state income tax.
And John,
Other comments?
yeah, they make it clear too that even if you upgraded both of your Massachusetts dwellings, you could only claim it for one of the
That's
dwellings,
correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
whichever route you go, refundable or
Other
non-refundable.
comments from the board? Comments from the, oh, go ahead, Ed.
The difficulty I'm going to see in this current fiscal climate is there's a great deal of unrest in the legislature right now over what's going to happen in fiscal '26 because of changes at the federal level. There's a lot of concern and there's a lot of talk already of reducing budgets that have been fixed for a long number of years because they don't think they'll have the federal support. And anything here that is not revenue neutral probably isn't going to fly very far. And I think that's a danger of expanding it. And I know it's kind of a negotiating tactic too, that, well, we can pull that out, but anything that delays it can kick it into, fiscal '27 instead of '26 or '28 because of that concern. And I think I want to remind folks that one of the reasons we started looking at this, in my memory anyway, is to help those of lower income who are going to be faced with either an IA or a sewer connection, because this applies to both. Doesn't have anything to do with betterments, which is unfortunate, but that's the way the law is written. But expanding it so that a second homeowner now would have eligibility in here can greatly expand the financial impact to the budget, unless Senator Fernandez's idea of putting an income cap comes in. So I think this is a dangerous thing to do, to try to expand it, I think.
Right,
the
keep in
current
mind, when they
fiscal
get to
climate.
conference committee, at some point, they're gonna have to put these bills together. I think that's where the battle will be, and Fernandez
Yep.
may win out, and it's as written with an income cap on it, only a refundable credit that's targeting lower middle-income people. But as you say, Vieira used this as maybe a potential bargaining chip down the road. That's why he put it in.
Yep, I understand.
All right, and comments from the visitors?
So I understand-
Z, you gotta get up to the microphone, because we're on TV.
Yeah.
On TV. Yep. Most people watch us all next week. We're on 5 days a week next week.
So I understand, in the context, we're going to look to reduce the. Zenas Crocker, I'm from the town of Barnstable, neighboring town, as we know.
Thank you.
A little different, but we're trying to do the same stuff, and we have the same problems. We're facing a lot of the same issues. I'm with Barnstable Clean Water Coalition. And so I understand the notion of trying to address the regressive nature of the current legislation, which I think is important, but is definitely regressive. I am not a man who understands the legislation process, so thank you for the flow chart. I think that's very helpful.
You're in good company.
It's complicated. I wonder if we have done here in Falmouth any modeling to understand what the implications are for this particular bill versus what Fernandez is suggesting. Because I agree with the gentleman who's saying, if we're going to tap into some very large potential numbers, I think it is going to be problematic. So I guess my one comment is, can we do modeling even if it's in some smaller areas? It's one of the things I've tried to do in the town of Barnstable, is pick some specific areas and do some modeling to look at the age of systems, the home ownership, what's the mix, et cetera, et cetera. So I think understanding that will be tremendously helpful in this process. That's
So,
it.
just to help fill in behind your question, my understanding is that when it went through the first time, inside the budgetary revenue folks of the state, they projected how many people would take advantage of the non-refundable portion. And there is actually a line item in the budget for it. I don't have the number in my head right now, see?
Yeah.
What Dave has sort of pointed out is, we put this together, and then the budgetary people in the legislature look at this and come back at one of these things with the readings or one of the other things and say, here's what we have now, we believe this is what the budgetary impact's gonna be. So rather than us trying to do it, the legislature will do it.
Fair enough. My only other comment would be, and I haven't talked to Julian Sear and others to make sure that we've got everybody pulling in the same direction throughout the peninsula. That's going to be critically
I
important.
welcome you to talk to them and see if, how they feel, and as necessary, have them reach out to Dave, okay?
I had emailed with Julian and his staff,
You
and,
gotta go to the microphone.
sorry. Yeah, I had sent emails to all the reps and senators on the Cape and Islands, and I think, so far they've all been positive, but only Vieira has actually taken the step, and hopefully Fernandez will take the step too to introduce bills. So.
Any other comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to the second item. Thank you, Jonathan. Good summary. I'm going to the podium, Steve. You're taking over directing the meeting as the vice chair, okay? So, today's meeting is all money all the time, I guess. We went through town meeting. There's been a lot of conversation about betterments. And I just felt for those that attend this meeting, some members of the board and anybody that's watching at home, understanding a little bit more about the state revolving fund and the Cape and Island Water Protection Fund would be of some value. So the 2025 SRF, just walk us all through it step by step a little bit. Towns had to have submitted what's called a project evaluation form, or a PEF, on or before July 26, 2024, which we took care of. And then the state evaluates the PEFs, and they rank them, and they establish from their sources what's the available funding, and then they create what's called an intended use plan. In other words, which projects are they going to fund? That's the IUP. Behind all of this is what's called the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and they established the available funding. They got set up originally with some federal money. They get some state money. They give out loans. The loans get paid back. The money goes back into the fund. They are the ultimate bank, if you will, for who issues the loans and what have to be paid off. So in 2025, for this year, the available funding for sewer projects and wastewater projects is $931.7 million. It's not an insignificant amount of money, but we have 351, I think, communities across the state, and everybody would like to get something done. The final intended use plan was issued on April 8th, 2025. And before we walked in to town meeting, there had been some buzz going on that we were only going to be able to get 50 million because of whatever. So it was a draft proposed regulation because of some demands on the system to manage the money a little bit better. A lot of people pushed back on that. In the final intended use plan that was put out, there was no restriction on the funding to $50 million. They did create a mechanism by which on any given year, they would not give out more than 50, but then they would have a carryover amount. And I'm not the financial expert or the bond expert, but I believe in terms of if you have one town meeting vote, what they did satisfies it. So the town has to have their funding in place by June 30th in order to qualify for the SRF funding that we would like to get. We have a town meeting vote, and in May, we go to a ballot vote. So, with a positive ballot vote, we're basically meet that criteria. And the IUP is actually parsed down to the project priority list. So the intended use plan is a slightly bigger number because the intended use plan, I guess, sits there as the projects they'd like to fund. But then the project priority list ranks projects by what they will fund until they run out of money. So, for example, my past experience around these things, you have a community that they get a vote at town meeting, but they don't get the ballot vote. So suddenly where we might be on the project priority list, if we don't have our paperwork in place, we get kicked to the next year, and the next person can roll up that list. So I thought I would reduce this down to the Cape and the islands. So this is the project priority list, not the intended use plan, but the project priority list. There's a lot of work that looks like it's coming forward on the Cape. Makes me wonder who's going to do all that work and how that will affect the bidding climate. But these are real projects. We are on there for the $60 million that we just voted at town meeting. I'm not going to read all this off. I'll leave them up there for you to take a look at it. The big elephant in the room is the Eastham wastewater phase 1. A number of other communities have broken their projects up a little bit. Eastham's going in there, for it all. So they'll get $50 million this year, and then they'll be deferred into subsequent years, going down the list. And that's not Yarmouth phase, oh my God, exclamation point. That should have been a 1. And Z, there's a couple in Barnstable, is it Finney or Finney? I never know how to pronounce that. Finney. So they want to build sewers in the Finney area, and they want to build sewers in the village, apparently. So those look like real projects. Okay.
Steve, can I just ask you a question connected to that list?
Please.
Just roughly, that adds up to about $500 million.
Huh?
500, yeah.
I got
500 million.
430, but
Roughly, all of those. But this is just the Cape, that's not the state list.
On the state at this point, the Cape is very heavily weighted because we are under a mandate from the DEP. Every community's had to go get money. Every community's got to do things. A lot of the other communities are not in the same situation.
Right, but you said that there were requests from other towns that aren't on the Cape.
I can get you a copy of the
No,
intended.
I just let's
Go ahead.
to the question. You said in the previous slide that the total amount was something like 900 million.
931.7.
Right. So over half of that is taken care of by the Cape list on the next slide.
Correct.
So you're saying the rest of the state, either the rest of the state, it's got to be quite small considering its size compared to the Cape, or the ones at the bottom of this list might as well forget it. Right?
I'm not sure, bottom of which list should they forget it?
In other words, you've distilled out just the Cape numbers here.
Correct.
And that by itself is adding up to 500 million,
Okay, so, yes,
to more than half of that that's allocated for the whole state.
Yes.
Whereas the Cape, even though we like it and we live here, is a tiny fraction of Massachusetts.
okay,
And so either we're lucky or as you said, the fraction of requests is in fact mainly coming from the Cape.
it is.
Okay, okay.
It is. Because we've all got this watershed plan that we're all facing, the Cape has got timelines that a lot of other communities don't have. But, for example, if you go to the greater Boston area, there's very few places that are not sewered or don't have a wastewater plant. There are a number of projects, and if you look at the list, mid part of the state or further out. But yeah, right now, the Cape has got some of the greatest needs for doing some wastewater. And on that intended use plan and then the project priority list, you get points for things. You get points that move you up the list, okay? And the fact that we are under these sort of DEP situations elevates us up in the list. Okay? Ken?
So, question on the 930 million, how does that pool change in size? Is there a way it can grow, shrink?
Let me go on to the next couple of slides,
Okay.
okay? So the answer is, it won't grow for this year. It does change from year to year, okay? So, I want to walk some people through, if we can, why is SRF funding a good thing? Okay, first off, if the town was to go out and borrow money, $60 million for the sewer project we have in front of us, currently the town is borrowing money at about 4.25%, okay? However, Falmouth qualifies for SR funding. We believe we'll get 0% because of everything we've got in place that we've used before. We don't see any reason not to get that. So the first and most important thing to realize is that getting an SRF loan at 0% in year one saves us $2,456,000 in interest costs. And municipal finance works like this. You make the same equal payment every year over the life of the loan. So we could turn around and say we're going to pay $3 million or whatever a year. I don't have the number in front of me. But you pay interest on the outstanding balance. So in the year one, you have a big nut. And in the final year, you have a smaller nut. But using a 30-year life of the loan, which is what we're expecting to get from the SRF, if we took a 30-year loan and the town borrowed that money at 4.25%, that would add $39,525,000 to the project's cost. So we would have gone to town meeting looking for authorization for a lot more money. Another aspect of the SRF process and loan that's is advantageous is you don't have to do the town doesn't have to do short-term borrowing to pay the contractor. They have to do a small amount. But as the contractor's monthly pay rec comes in, it gets submitted in to the trust fund, and they reimburse it. It typically runs on a 45 to 60-day cycle. So you have to have enough money to cover 60 days, but the rest of it gets paid back. So since short-term borrowing is not required, typically you can't go to the bond market to do a bond for something that's under construction. You have to pay for it to be built and then bond it for long-term. We save short-term borrowing. The other thing is, right now, because of the economics in a portion of Falmouth, we actually qualify as a disadvantaged communities program. And in the SRF regulations right now, they call out a 3.3% loan forgiveness if you're a disadvantaged communities program. So if we go in for a $60 million loan it would get reduced by $1,600,000 because of that 3.3 loan forgiveness. Now, the next big thing to follow through here is you have to be on the intended use plan to get into the Cape and Island grant funding. So what is that? The Cape and Island Water Protection Fund was established by the Mass Legislature in 2018. Got established with a lot of hard work by all the Cape communities, some understanding of what we were seeing coming. This was even before we got the nitrogen-sensitive zones and the scale of the projects that we're facing. It is actually a dedicated fund within the Mass Clean Water Trust. In other words, money raised goes into the Mass Clean Water Trust and then is to be designated back out through actions of the Cape and Island Water Protection Funds Board against the project costs that are approved. It only applies to the communities within Barnstable County, Dukes County, and Nantucket County. Where does the money come from? There's a 2.75% excise tax on traditional lodging and short-term rentals, okay? So unless you're doing it on the side by yourself, if you're going through Airbnb or the other short-term rental companies, they collect that money and turn it back over. You have to be on the SRF IUP to receive funds from the Cape and Island Water Protection Fund. The goal of the Cape and Island Water Protection Fund has been to reimburse or subsidize 25% of the project costs. They've had to do a little juggling over time. They sort of switched from a straight outright subsidization model to a more stretched out subsidizing on a year-to-year basis against the loan to maintain that. But they've been pretty good about it. They've been smart. So for Falmouth, going back to our $60 million job, this could reduce the overall project costs to the community by up to $15 million. Now, these numbers will juggle a little bit as the project goes forward. Everybody good? All right. So, well, wrong place. We already talked about that. I'm going to do the funding caveats now. Certain project costs are excluded from all of this. They're primarily any legal costs, any financing costs, or any land acquisition costs. The underlying SRF funding is 20% state and 80% federal. That's how it was originally set up. Then there's the way the money rolls back around each year. We're living in interesting times. The federal percentage could change in future years. They do appear to be in place through 2025 because the money's already pretty much there. The other one is the Cape and Island Fund depends on tourism. An economic downturn would impact revenues, and the governing board would have to take a hard look at whether they were going to hold to the 25 or go to a lower number. Did I get to your question, Ken?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions from the board? From the audience? There's one behind you, Steve.
Yeah. Malcolm Donald, how does Falmouth qualify as a disabled or whatever, disadvantaged community?
It has to do with median income, not median worth, but median income. And there's a table in the back of the SRF intended use plan that relates to that, Malcolm. Okay?
Thank you.
So I wonder if the town of Falmouth has looked at using SRF funding for innovative alternative septic systems yet. I think we've seen the first application of that in Wellfleet, which I understand has been approved. It's somewhat complex as I understand it, because I believe that the equipment is what can be financed, not the installation of the equipment. So that's one part of the question. And then the other part of the question is the 80-20 mix. I listened to a presentation by Andrew Gottlieb, who indicated that because of the money that's currently out, the state revolving fund money that's currently out, the state is able to recapture a lot of that
Right.
and continue to use that leverage as financing.
Right.
So even though obviously I think we're all concerned that we could be at risk for federal money, I'm not sure what how big that
I
might
can answer
be.
both your questions. I'll answer the second one first. So there is money in the whole trust, and communities pay back. But to the extent that what the communities pay back and the level of things that are needed to be funded and everything, if they need more, if they need an infusion of capital into the bank, historically, it's been 20% and 80%. Because it's not that whole 931 million is 20/80 state and federal. The large bulk of that is coming back out of the revenues. And someplace over there, I have the whole big package for the state revolving fund, and you can, anybody that wants to play accountant can look through all of the numbers on it. The second one is we're very much aware of what's going on in Wellfleet. I would agree with you that they first off, they did get SRF funding. Apparently, it is only going for the purchase but not the installation. We are keeping a close eye on that, and we view that as a resource or alternative on the next steps going forward, okay?
Any other questions?
Okay. All right, how do I get to the next one?
I'm coming.
Keeping myself organized. So at a recent Water Quality Management Committee meeting, we put forth a way of looking at watersheds to ascertain where the cost benefit might be relative to whether we should expand the sewer service area and reduce the IA areas or not, in which we worked up a rubric or a metric, not a rubric, a metric, that talked about dollars per kilogram removed. At least one, if not more, board members felt that there were other cost factors that needed to be considered as we looked at that. So we haven't rolled those cost considerations back into the evaluation of watersheds yet, but I wanted to walk through what some of these numbers are and how they fit together. Because people stand up and they say, this costs this or that costs that. So to the best extent available from the data that's been rattling around, I've put together a little cost consideration. So capital costs on a sewer system. What is the town cost? If we have to upgrade the plant, that's a town cost. We're, how far along, Amy? We 2/3 of the way through the plant upgrade? 55%. We're 55% on the current plant upgrade. We know that as we add more sewer areas, we're gonna face at least one, possibly two more plant upgrades in a 50-year cycle. We also have the town's cost for an outfall and a diffuser, which I think we've talked about where we're at with that several times. There's a big effluent line that has to get from the plant to the outfall. Pump stations, particularly when they serve multiple areas or neighborhoods, are typically town costs. And the force mains from the pump station to the treatment plant are town costs. The town has, for the Mara Vista area, purchased the grinder pumps and provided them to homeowners for installation. And then there is the sewer lines that are in the street, or the low-pressure lines in the street. And the cost for those, 30% of those, the town picks up the cost of that. So what's the homeowner's cost? The homeowner's got to pay for a connection from the house to the sewer line in the street in front of them. They have to pay for the abandonment of their septic system. If they have a grinder pump, they frequently have to pay something for an electrical upgrade. And then they pay 70% of the cost of sewer lines in the street. That becomes known as the betterment. Back in 2017, we did the Mara Vista area. If you had a gravity connection, the homeowner's connection from the house to the sewer in the street, it averaged $3,828. Somebody managed to pull it off for $2,000. Somebody spent $6,000. You know, the variables are how far are you from the street, landscape, and other things. Did the same sort of table down below for the grinders. And then, for lack of anything better, I've used 4% escalation throughout anything I'm doing here. And so one could project that the cost to connect a gravity line will average around $5,239. You could bump that up by a couple of 4% times if you want to go to 2027. I just didn't do that in my math today. And the same thing for the grinder pumps, okay? What's the annual cost for the sewer use? So, in 2025, looking at the way the wastewater user fee is currently structured, which has, I think you would call it a meter fee? There's a base fee that everybody's got to pay. I think it might be called a meter fee. Yeah, but it's like, I think it's around $125. And then, you know, as Kristen's been speaking to us for the watersheds, we've seen numbers between 110 and 140 gallons per household from the various things. I used 130, and I did this assuming that somebody lives in the house year-round. I didn't try to prorate it for any seasonal use. So, right now, a year-round homeowner on the wastewater system is paying around $460 for the wastewater user fee. Could be more, could be less, depending upon how the house is run. So if the town continues to raise their rates, and the process there is once a year, the water department and the wastewater department and other departments are asked, are the fees being charged reasonable? Do you want to raise them? And they submit a request through the DPW that goes to the Board of Selectmen, and the Selectmen has a fee hearing. The wastewater fee has been held pretty level over the last few years. It was shifted to a tiered system. In other words, your first 10 units, and a unit is 778 gallons, if you need to know that. Your first units get priced one way, from 10 to, I think, 60 in a year, gets priced slightly higher. And then if you use more than 60 units in a year, it's even a third tier higher. So it discourages people from wasting water. Anyways, 20 years from now, escalating at 4%, the average homeowner will be paying about $1,000 a year for wastewater. Oh, but wait a minute. What if I have a grinder pump? The grinder pumps don't use an awful lot of electricity because they cycle, they fill up and then they empty. I worked off of E1's data for typical electric consumption in kilowatt hours. I estimate the 2025 electrical cost for a grinder pump is $49. If electricity goes up at 4%, in 20 years, the homeowner on the grinder pump will be paying that $1,000 plus another $107 in electric costs. And currently, the betterment estimated range over a 30-year payback period is estimated to be $900 to $1,333 per year. I've not tried to do anything other than that, take that number ahead, because once that betterment is set in place, it's not subject to inflation. So, you know, you pay the same amount every year going forward. Now let's compare that to an IA system. There's several variables on an IA system. Do you have a cesspool? You know, is the lot big, small, everything else? Didn't try to drill down into every variable there. I said, I'll just look at the assumption that given the age of the places that we're putting sewers into, there's a reasonable expectation that they've got a Title V system. These aren't like legacy neighborhoods from the 40s and the 50s that would have a cesspool. They're likely to have something close to a Title V system right now. What do the towns cost? One of the things we're going to need to circle back to in our conversations over this year is the whole septic utility program we talked about, where, there's an entity that the town is supporting that's doing a lot of the monitoring and measuring. That's yet to be decided, but I put it in there as a potential town cost. What's the homeowner's cost? First off, they got to hire an engineer, a couple $1,000s to figure out what to do. They have to buy an IA module. Typically, it's going to come with a pump because it's unlikely that there's a gravity situation. They'll have to divert from the septic tank to the IA module and then pump back into the leaching field. Again, they're likely to have an electrical upgrade. And then there's an installation cost to put in the ground. We've been working with a range of $30,000 to $50,000 for doing that work. $25. What does it cost to run an IA system? Currently, folks have to get an O&M contract. One of the things that we need to consider is whether the O&M portion of all of this should be moved into the SUP. But some people pay as low as $1,100 a year. Some people pay as much as $3,000 a year. It's a free market system, and there's not a lot of players in it. Electricity. The current cost to run an IA system is $373 a year of electricity. The blower typically runs all the time. Over 20 years, that price at the 4% factor will inflate up to $816. Right now, the Board of Health's regulation in this town requires, for the first 2 years of operation, that there be quarterly testing of the effluent to demonstrate that the system is accurately performing. As of yesterday morning, the lab charges $60 to do a TKN analysis. So the lab cost is $240 a year. People talk about what they have to spend because they have an IA system. A big portion of that cost is inside the O&M contract. And then the person who does that work gathers the sample, takes it to the lab, and then they get a lab bill and they tack it on. If the system's working the way it's designed, the Board of Health will reduce it down to 2 per year upon proven system performance. So I thank Ed, because Ed did his own summary of costs at one point. I generally agree with a lot of his numbers. He was able to check what I did over the last couple days to make sure that he's not going to raise his hand and say, how about, what if? But what he did was the thing where he tried to do a summary of out-of-pocket costs for primary homeowners with the current tax credits, not anything that John talked about maybe being available in the future, or town subsidies beyond what we have. So for a sewer, I just assumed the betterment was $30,000. It's a little bit higher than the low number that Amy has put forth. It's a bit below, well, it's well below the upper boundary, but I'm reasonably confident that we will get 25% from the Cape and Island, that we'll get the 3.3% values in front of us. So I think 30 is a reasonable working number for this conversation. The average 2025 grinder cost would be $7,143. The tax credit right now, you can only claim 60% of the installation cost, which would be the cost to get from your house to the street. I calculated that out as about $4,286. Some numbers rattling around in here, but with no tax credit, the homeowner's out-of-pocket expense is going to be in the $37,000 plus range. With the tax credit, it's reduced a little bit to about $33,000. What happens on the IA? On the IA, the installation for primary residence is gonna run around 40,000. I could have used the 30, I could have used the 50, I chose the 40. The thing is, they will be able to get 60% of that install cost, so they will be able, if they're paying state taxes at a reasonable rate, they'll be able to get the full $18,000 credit that is out there, which means that their cost with the credit is around $22,000. Now, as we keep talking, you know, an IA system only achieves half the nitrogen reduction of a sewer connection. But for the individual homeowner, you get on the sewer, you're gonna be putting a moderately priced, well, the car prices are changing. You got a pretty big number to pay, but it gets spread out. On the IA, it's not quite as steep. But they're real numbers. These are not, this isn't painting your garage. This is costing some money to everybody. So, that's as far as I've gotten. But I did want to try to get all the numbers down in one place for everybody to sort of see them and follow them, and to the extent you want my Excel spreadsheets for how I did any of this stuff, I'll be glad to send it to you.
Thank you. Should we take questions from the board? And
You're the chair, you tell me what you
any
want to do.
questions from the board? We'll start with John's end first.
I guess this is the maximum credit for, getting the Title V septic credit, but again, lots of folks won't qualify that on the low end, especially. We talked about the income disparity, so that 22,000 quickly escalates closer to the 40,000 because they can't deduct as much from the front end. And that's the part that's always worried me, that we're disproportionately helping our wealthier homeowners in the town at the expense of the lower income people.
Yep.
So,
Yeah. I had to choose someplace to
no,
come
I
at this.
understand, but just that point needs to be hammered home again.
Yeah.
John? Ed?
I think the reason that I spent some hours working this, and then Steve has put together a lot of great analysis here, is to demonstrate that sewering, even though the town is paying a portion of the cost, is an extremely expensive option. And, there's been a lot of dialogue going on, and it continues to, since we subsidize the sewer as a town, shouldn't we also subsidize the IA? And that's an ongoing discussion, but I think it's important to have these numbers in front of people that are making that discussion, because depending on that betterment, that's the big driver for the people that are mandated to hook to the sewer. Depending on that betterment, it becomes extremely expensive to hook up to the sewer versus the IA, because that state tax credit, as is currently structured, heavily more subsidizes, so it's more state money going to the IA than proportionally to the sewer connection folks. Betterments aren't eligible for that tax credit. And as that betterment goes up, and now, there was discussion at town meeting about that betterment range of 27 to 40. When Little Pond was sewered, the original betterment estimate was 18,000. After about a year, it was reduced to an estimate of 16. And quite fortunately, because of some really good engineering and working with the contractor, the final betterment was just over 13. So from 18 to 16 to 13. Hopefully, we'll have that same kind of good fortune going forward. And I think, Amy and the engineering folks have done a lot of work to make sure they're using very, very conservative numbers in estimating this sewer cost. But it's critical that we get that town-wide ballot approved so we don't lose our place in the SRF funding. But as we continue the dialogue going forward, Falmouth currently does not have an IA mandate as Wellfleet does, and some of the towns on the Vineyard, Mashpee has. So we're not doing much with IAs under a mandate from our Board of Health. But hopefully in the not-too-distant future, they will start putting in some triggers for installing IAs And that's where this number becomes more important.
What I didn't do in this analysis, I didn't take it to sort of the next step, which is, if you're on the sewer, the town will put that on your sort of tax bill over 30 years at a certain value. If you're doing an IA, currently, there's no mechanism for the town to put it on your tax bill. So you would have to either have that money in the bank or put it added to your existing mortgage at whatever rate that is and whatever cost that is. So there is another level on this of, what's your cash flow on a yearly basis that could be done.
Ken? Any questions?
I don't.
I've got a question, Steve, before I go to Gordon. Have you considered also using these same numbers, the same, no additional research, just if you just compare the total, what you consider the town government with its tax money and the homeowners as a single black box, I'm going to call the town. You just look at the total cost to the town of the sewers per property and the total cost for IA. And per amount of nitrogen removed, which then effectively doubles the IA. Look at whichever is less, and then it's just an exercise in fairness, how you divvy that up with betterments to make it as fair as possible. But, just common sense tells me the first thing you do is reduce the total cost and then figure out how you make it fair to the taxpayers versus the homeowners. Does that make any sense?
Not sure I understand. Are you asking for the total project cost? Are you asking
I'm
for?
saying it's overly confusing to consider the betterments and how much is being paid by the homeowner and how much by the town, which is the taxpayers, which turns out to be in some cases also the homeowners, but you're clearly separating it out here. Whereas if you had a club or a corporation or any other entity, you'd just look at the total cost and minimize that, and then have a separate, that minimizing the total cost in principle is a benefit to everybody in the town. The only person that loses are the vendors, and we don't care about them. And then you have a separate discussion about how you divvy that total cost up. In other words, what the betterments are. And although there was initial objection to having betterment for IAs, there's recently been talk, including from the town council, that it may be possible after all. It remains to be seen, but I'd hate to have a higher total cost just because we had some weird non-optimum way of divvying it up.
So I would say that having introduced a way of looking at costs in the watershed for combinations of sewer and IAs, that we sort of put on pause to come back to some of this stuff, Steve. The exercise on a watershed by watershed basis was to look at the optimum overall project cost, okay? We just haven't done that work yet.
Okay. Anybody, questions from the audience? Amy?
What did I mess up, Amy?
Amy Lowell, wastewater superintendent. Thank you very much for doing that, Steve. That's a lot of very useful information for everybody, including me. I just had a couple of points. When you were talking about the grinder pump costs, there was a low, a middle, and a high. The high, there were numbers that were higher than that high. Is my only point on that is some of the grinder pump property owners, or some, both gravity and grinder pump, had higher costs, and we actually threw those out of the average to come up with the grinder pump reimbursement.
I'm sorry.
So that's okay. So
there were outliers.
right. So that high number excluded the outliers, and probably the low may have as well. For grinder pump purchase and providing to the property owners and grinder pump reimbursement, I just want to note again, I think this has been noted recently, but we need special legislation, and there will be discussion of that by the select board and then a vote likely at this fall town meeting. So that is the plan, but the town can't guarantee that the town is providing the grinder pumps and doing that reimbursement until that special legislation passes. The last legislation was specific to Little Pond, and so it needs to be renewed for this and future projects. And the last thing I wanted to note is that we are due for a sewer rate increase, and I will be looking at that.
So much to unpack, so much to unpack. Peter Hargraves,
Stand here, Peter, so they can.
okay,
You
okay,
can scroll up and down if you need.
here we go, because I want to look at this. So, the danger with it, thank you, and thank you for making this template that shows and features the elements of all the different systems.
Thank you. The way
Thank
I
you,
put it
Ed.
together was a little bit harder to understand. I just
So-
I'm his editor.
So, if you wanted to make the most provocative statement possible about this, you would say, the town and all the taxpayers in the town, whether they're on the sewer or not, subsidize and underwrite the cost of sewers, and for the people who are stuck with IAs, it's all on them. And by the way, if we go the route of Dylan Fernandez, then it's going to be that people who actually pay more than $4,000 a year in Massachusetts income tax maybe won't be allowed to because we'll have to subsidize other people. And so that's kind of the political twist, but it gets to the point that I want to make. When you do something like this, people are going to look at this and they're going to say, IA systems are much cheaper for me to own. So you had an operating cost element. So I suggest that as you polish this, that you kind of get to a total annual cost line so they're more directly comparable. And to that effect, the IA people are subsidizing all of the 30% that the town pays because our taxes are all going to cover that line. The betterment is 70% to the people on the sewer, and of course they have installation and operating expenses. So if you want to make a direct comparison, apples to apples, you would add the cost of the town subsidized elements, because both are taxpayers in Falmouth. The other thing that is really going to dramatically affect and maybe even swing the IA into a higher cost regime than the sewer, and that's the dangerous part of showing this. You made a point earlier that the betterments are fixed, and for the 30-year life, there's no increase. But for these people, well, according to Dylan, it's pocket change for them to pay out of their checking account. But if they have to take a loan, it'll probably be at 6 or 7%, and they'll have to finance it over a period of time. And you can only take $4,000 a year well, you couldn't take it for all 6 years maximum, because that would be $24,000, and $18,000 isn't a maximum. So you have to put in the cost of the homeowner. Well, that's in the spirit of the homeowner is all in on the IA. They would have to pay the financing. And thank you, Steve, for saying, we started this discussion looking for justice and equity in the distribution of costs, and I think we've really drifted away from that.
I did note that I hadn't gone to the next step here, which is to show the annual cost for the out-of-pocket expenses for each of these people, and then add the other numbers onto them. But that's more a factor of I ran out of gas late yesterday.
No, it's great.
Okay, but taking the annual cost for sewers and annual cost for IAs, and then adding to it, what you're gonna pay where it's 0% on the sewer and what you're gonna be paying if you go borrow the money at a bank, that slide can be built.
I'm not criticizing the work.
I know you're not, I'm just telling you I didn't get to it.
Oh, so all I'm saying is, you know what town meeting's gonna look at. They're gonna look at that. And it's not a fair comparison of the cost to the homeowner by virtue of the elements that I brought up. But when you polish it and add it in, then it will.
Steve, my only comment is, for larger context, we have a certain target amount of nitrogen we need to get rid of. And if we could include some metric that says, okay, per kilogram of nitrogen removed, the cost of for septics is this, and for the sewer is that.
I agree with you. So we started off with discussing how we do this on a watershed basis for the dollars. We got asked to not just look at the capital numbers, but look at the other numbers and factor them in. We haven't pulled this all back together yet, but rather than wait weeks or whatever, I felt like coming before you and saying, here's where we're at and here's
Well,
what we're
this
gonna
gives you
use.
the homeowner perspective.
Yeah.
But-
All right.
Steve, another way of expressing what I was trying to say is, suppose you had a given mix of sewers and IAs. You had it all laid out. You knew which properties were gonna get it. You knew all the costs. You knew the amount of subsidies, the amount of betterments and everything. And then somebody came along with a way to make the total cost lower by changing, say, the ratio of sewers to IAs. And they figured out that this made the total cost lower. But on the particular scheme of betterments and subsidies and so on, it actually made it look worse. Then mathematically, there would be a way to change that scheme to make it lower for everybody, because your total is lower. But I won't beat a dead horse.
No, it's not a dead horse. You're still in charge. I haven't taken it back yet. You have to recognize Amy.
I forgot to mention one more thing, which is the County Aqua Fund, which provides low-interest loans, 0 to 4% interest loans, for either a required sewer connection or a required septic system replacement. And that 0 to 4% range on the interest depends on the income level and the residency of like if it's your primary home versus a secondary home. So that is there available to help with either of these costs on the connection side. Obviously, it doesn't help on a betterment, but it does help with sewer connection costs or IA costs.
Thank you. I'm turning the meeting back over to you.
Next item on the agenda is watershed plan requirements. I think at some point, everybody on this committee has probably heard this before, but we are marching towards actually going out and finding somebody to start putting together watershed plans. I think, Amy, if I can put you on the spot, you're planning on going for funding in fall for watershed plans?
Yes.
Thought it'd be a good time now just to come back to what's in a watershed plan and what'll have to happen so that we've got a sense of what people will have to do to get us to a watershed plan and get it approved. Take it away.
Kristen Rathjen, Sciencewares. So at the last meeting, I talked a little bit about 2 of the natural resource nitrogen-sensitive area awards that the town just received, and mentioned that they were for planning of what has to go into this watershed permit application. So as Steve said, figured we'd take a step back and review for everybody what is entailed in putting together the watershed plan according to the new regulations. So, watershed permit. These regulations establish a process for municipalities to restore and protect water quality in nutrient-impacted watersheds. The permit establishes performance standards, authorized activities, and outlines the timeframes that'll be used under adaptive management. So this is basically the same thing as what our comprehensive wastewater management plans do as well, but a little bit more highlights the timeframes because you're restricted to that 20-year timeframe. Falmouth's plan. So when the state promulgated the new regulations, all municipalities were given two options. Option one, upgrade all septic systems to IAs in a watershed, or apply for a watershed permit and go the adaptive management route. Falmouth chose to apply for watershed permits for all its nitrogen-sensitive areas. The tentative plan for this, as John had said during his presentation, Falmouth is looking at applying for 4 different permits, grouping select watersheds together to be covered under the same permit. So the first permit, the town intends to apply for by January 27. That is Little Pond and Great Pond. Second one, the following year, which would include Green Pond, Bournes Pond, Eel Pond, and Wacoit Bay. The next one for 2029 would be Oyster Pond, Falmouth Inner Harbor, and West Falmouth Harbor. And then the last one to be applied for by January 2030 would be Wild Harbor, Megansett Harbor, Fiddler's Cove, Rand's Canal, and Quisset Harbor. The deadline under the regulations to apply for watershed permits is June of 2030. So there is a buffer built into this, and this is a tentative timeline. As we've said before, the town wants to stagger these plans because there's reporting requirements that go with all of these, including a 5-year update. So this will stagger that 5-year update for each of the permits. So, besides a couple of other little administrative things, the 2 main elements that are required for a watershed permit application are a watershed management plan, and if it's shared watershed, an intermunicipal agreement. So the watershed management plan, there's a whole list of elements that are required that have to be contained within this watershed plan, including maps depicting the watershed boundary, description of current and historic water quality conditions, any earlier planning approaches, maps depicting core sewer areas, documentation of the pollutant load reduction plan and timeline, contingency plan or for a backup conventional approach, description of each proposed pollutant reduction action for current and projected loads, cost estimates for proposed infrastructure and programs, implementation schedule not to exceed 20 years grouped into the 5-year period. Again, that's the timeline for the permit itself. Monitoring plan including parameters and a quality assurance program plan. Information sources used to develop the watershed management plan, and proposed alternative plan if you will not attain 100% reduction to meet your TMDL during that 20-year permit term. So then the big item in there is the description and timing of ongoing and planned implementation activities, included updated nitrogen loads. So this is a big element that is needed for all of the watersheds because the MEP data is 20 years old. And within that, projected nitrogen loads for following 20 years. This could be the same or could be different from the MEP build-out numbers. Depends what the updated nitrogen load numbers tell you. The percents and methods for reductions during the permit, identification of conventional and alternative approaches, where those implementations are going to happen, how much nitrogen is going to be reduced by either of those technologies, and an implementation schedule for each alternative approach, including a time frame for acceptance or abandonment of such approach. So, Falmouth has several existing approved plans. Will these meet the requirements for the watershed plan as outlined in these regulations? Short answer is they can, provided that those plans include or are supplemented with each of those elements that I went through. So Falmouth has the original 2013 Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan, that's for the South Coast and West Falmouth, has a 2014 amended Targeted Watershed Management Plan, that was for Little Pond. 2019, it was the CWMP update for the South Coast and West Falmouth, and then 2022 had the TWMP for Great Pond. So those are the 4 primary planning documents that the town has that they can use to submit as bulk of elements for these watershed plans for these watersheds. So those 2 planning grants, the natural resource nitrogen sensitive area, as I said, they're planning grants. The town decided to put 2 applications in. The first one was to work on things associated with Little Pond and Great Pond, because that's the first watershed permit the town wants to apply for. So because those 2 watersheds are greatly detailed between those planning documents, the scope for that grant is to identify what elements are missing from all of those existing planning documents necessary to meet the watershed permit. I can tell you first and foremost is the updated nitrogen load numbers, which is the second item for the scope. So determine the updated nitrogen load numbers and evaluate the existing plan with respect to these new numbers. So GHD has acquired all of the town's water use data for the last 5 years, and they are starting to work on those updated nitrogen numbers. Then developed a phase implementation plan in 5-year increments. So that's kind of the scope of what that first award is. The second award was put in for Megansett, Fiddlers, and Rands. That was done because these 3 are part of the final permit. They don't make up the full permit, but these 3 have not had any formal planning, and they're actually kind of grouped together because Fiddler's Cove and Rands Canal actually empty into Megansett Harbor. So any improvements within those 2 watersheds will have an effect on Megansett. And Megansett has actually been pretty much achieving its threshold nitrogen concentration at the Sentinel Station for the last 5 years. So the first item on here, again, is to determine the updated nitrogen loads. GHD, again with the townwide water use data, is doing that. Then to formally look at Falmouth's contribution. There's been a number thrown around for Megansett that Falmouth contributes 61%. So similar to what we did for Wacoit Bay, looking at the actual loading and who's responsible for what and where. And those numbers will be used to start the discussions for an intermunicipal agreement with Bourne. And then the final element of that scope is to estimate the nitrogen load reductions and descriptions of management approaches to meet the TMDLs. So that's going back to potentially the geo-boundaries and refining what it might take in those 3 watersheds to get there, because the town could work on implementing a plan there ahead of being under a watershed permit.
I'm gonna start with down Jonathan.
Does the 2022 wastewater management plans for Great Pond, Little Pond, did that incorporate all the recent work on IA systems? Or is that something that has to be added into the sewering and the other nitrogen reduction tools?
What do you mean by recent work on IAs?
Well, you looked at how many IAs would have to be done in each watershed.
No.
So that will be part of this, because we know we can't get there with sewering alone, so.
Correct. Yep.
Nothing for me.
You good, Tom? John? Steve?
If I were the town manager, I would ask the following really simple question, only partly tongue-in-cheek. This is a lot of work.
Right.
A lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to cost millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Just the analysis and writing the reports. Right? Certainly
I don't
hundreds
know.
of
The
thousands,
reports aren't gonna cost millions.
Right.
including the research to write them. I mean, I would want to know how that total amount, some rough back-of-the-envelope calculation, compares to the difference between A, the alternative that everybody thought was so bad, which was to put IAs in everywhere, and what the actual cost will be as a result of doing these reports. And I would hope that the amount for the reports was a lot less than that difference.
So you would still need to do the evaluations to determine whether putting IAs everywhere would meet your TMDL. Because if it doesn't,
What if we'd chosen that, to put in all the IAs, and it didn't work?
then you have to go back and do something else. You either have to go back and sewer, because that's your conventional backup plan.
Okay, then I'll change it to the difference between what we might do after the reports and what a back-of-the-envelope simple calculation would be with some sewers to make sure that we met the TMDL. In other words, it's not irresponsible engineering, if you're really sure, to do something conservatively and to avoid a huge expense of finding out how to optimize it by 10%. I hope somebody's thought about that intuitively. That's all.
I think the first step,
You hear what I'm saying,
I
right?
heard what you said. There is an approved watershed plan for Buttermilk Bay. And we will look up that number, so you have some sense of, and that was a difficult one, because it involved 4 towns?
You're talking Pleasant Bay?
Pleasant Bay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
4
Sorry,
towns.
Pleasant
Yes.
Bay. So Pleasant Bay's got a plan. It required 4 towns to raise money, to appropriate it, and to put it together. And it's it's the one plan I'm aware of so far.
Yep.
It's a very complex plan, but we can find that number, Steve, and bring it to another meeting, so you'll have a sense of what a complex plan costs. And the cost for that one, in my mind, I just do this, because some of this stuff is gonna be the same stuff for each watershed, okay? We're not gonna reinvent a component that talks about what lawn fertilizer may or may not do for each watershed. We're gonna develop something that says this is what we think lawn fertilizer may or may not do, and that'll get moved along. So I'm just feeling like if we get the Pleasant Bay number, we could use a multiple of 2 or 3 of that for all 14 watersheds
Right, yeah.
as an initial guess. And that would be a back of the envelope.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I defer, I mean, your background is way closer to all this stuff than mine is. And you may just have a very good intuitive feel that surely these reports will cost a tiny fraction of what they're likely to save. But I think it could be shared with other people.
so 6 of those watersheds are covered under the CWMP, and the first step would be the evaluation of how the nitrogen numbers have changed. Maybe they haven't changed from the MEP, and those plans are still valid. That's a big question, so there might not be as much reworking there. There could be more. That's a big unknown.
Remind me, we got a grant for Little Pond and Great Pond. How much was it, like 50 or 60,000?
45.
45. So we have $45,000, and we're doing what I think is the hardest component of this, which is we're revisiting the nitrogen loads between our consultant and Crystal right now to say, that's the MEP nitrogen load, a legitimate nitrogen load, or to Tom's point, there's other data points rattling around that would tell us that nitrogen is different from what the MEP said. So that's a big component of what will happen in a final plan, Steve. Okay? You're next, Ed.
I think it's a good start. I think it's great that we've got these initial planning grants that'll help to identify what's got to happen. And, I understand Steve Layton's point about, what's this analysis going to cost? Bottom line, you got to do this analysis either way. And if we took the hell with it, everybody's going to have to do an IA. Problem is, then it doesn't work, and we know it won't work because our analysis and modeling has said we've got to sewer the lower watersheds. Now, not only did those folks have to put in IAs, but now they got a sewer. And it's going to be 30 years from now, and none of us on this committee will be here, but that problem, you're
I'll
just
be
kicking
here.
the can down the
I'll
road.
be here.
And the
I'm
numbers
sticking
will
around.
explode more than they are already.
So, just a benchmark to your question. So these 2 grants we got, it was a block of money, and we expect that to see a similar block of money next year or the year after, where they're putting money out there to help communities get to watershed plans. Okay? So, 8 of the communities submitted. I would venture to say that Brewster, Chatham, and Dennis applied for the money to do their watersheds, And so those numbers like 133,000, to 175,000 for them to do their watersheds. So it's not millions, okay? I mean, that's another sort of metric to use, okay? Okay? All right.
Ken, are you to me?
You ready, Ken?
You already did some of the basic background for these things, right? So what we're talking about is sort of the next level of refinement on what you
With those updated nitrogen loads.
And so I'm just trying to understand the mechanics here. Are we engaging GHD to do that work? So, okay,
Yes.
so this will be next level refinement using professional engineering firm. And then, once those plans are accepted, I guess, is that what happens? They go to the state accepts them? Implementation now requires the next level of design, engineering. For example, if you're gonna do sewers, I just wanna be sure I understand the mechanics of what we're talking about.
Right.
If you're
It-
gonna do IAs, what's the next level of, for that?
That could be the town
Board of Health?
voting a district.
Right.
This is a big part of when we actually get to doing the watershed plans. We're gonna have to have some conversations with Board of Health and the Selectmen about, this plan's gonna go in, it's gonna say we're gonna, put 200 a year into this watershed, 200 every year for 5 years or whatever. And how we're gonna do that is gonna have to be established, okay? If you have a good idea, I'm willing to listen.
I think that's gonna be really interesting. But,
Yeah, but I mean, the process-wise, the plan has to be put together, and it has to be stamped by a registered professional engineer in Massachusetts. The plan has to go before the Board of Selectmen for their acceptance, and/or possibly, depending on what path we go down with IAs, before town meeting.
when you say the plan, you mean the comprehensive plan, including sewers
We
and.
don't
IA.
submit a watershed plan with all the stuff that will be in it to the state till the town has accepted the plan,
Okay.
okay?
Amy had her hand up.
Yeah. Amy?
Kristen did a beautiful job summarizing all of this, and I'm really glad that you applied for it and got the grants to do the work. I wanted to clarify that we're not committing to submitting these plans as soon as they are complete. The grant work is due by the end of June, or by end of June. So the next, ultimately, after a watershed plan is complete, we will, after the town decides it's complete, then we apply for a watershed permit. And that's really, when they grant us the permit, it's linked to the plan. So that would be.
Starts a timeline.
Right. So what the work that Kristen, ScienceWares, and GHD is doing is not necessarily going to get us to the final plan, but it's a next big chunk of work. And the watershed plans will include a schedule for the work, as Kristen said, and that will have to reflect the reality of what we can say at the time we submit them about what we can do. So the town will have to, so for example, as you know, the additional sewering is contingent on additional discharge site, which the town is planning on an outfall, but the plan will have to, say that. And so our when we submit these plans, it doesn't mean we have to immediately begin to do the work, but we have to be prepared to do the work in the schedule we're saying we're going to do the work.
But you have 20 years, is that correct, for implementation?
The watershed permit regulation, it says, yes, you have 20 years, but it also provided an exception for a watershed for towns that have 14 watersheds, for example, and where compliance may take, like, a Great Pond is going to require an enormous amount of work, and that may be a watershed that will take more than 20 years, and there's an exception there's an allowance in the regulation to request more than 20 years if needed to.
Well, what about
I'm
McCoy?
gonna-
And McCoy potentially as well. Great Pond is even tougher, I think.
Nobody's gone for the exception yet, and
No.
I think that for most of our public conversation, we're better off talking about the fact we've got to put a plan in, sure, we're gonna get there in 20 years. And if we get to year 10 and we're having trouble, we can ask for some relief, okay? But I wouldn't start off by saying we need relief when we walk in. I think.
But that did occur to me as a, because
Oh, yeah.
14 watersheds is a lot different than 2.
Somewhat.
So the last bit, it's, we know how to, how sewers work, right? We know how to, you get a design, you get a sewer service area, you build it, et cetera. So it seems to me that the fuzziest thing that's left here is how do you mandate IA hookups? And
I'm gonna momentarily.
do you agree?
I do. I'm gonna momentarily throw out the Wellfleet model right now, which Wellfleet went and got an SRF commitment, and they identified places that the IAs are gonna have to go in, and they said to people, if you put an IA in, we will use this SRF money towards the cost of your IA, and when the money's gone, the money's gone.
Right.
So they incentivized,
But we talked about that some time
Incentivized.
ago, is that,
Yeah.
you get more help early and,
we're not there yet.
So one caveat with going with SRF funding for IAs is to get the 0% loan, you have to have basically growth controls, even with IA districts. Because if you upgrade your IA, then you have the right to increase your bedrooms. So that would mean more land purchase for conservation or some way to control additional flow for the 0% loan.
so that's another pet peeve of mine, or pet topic, which is that runs into the affordable housing question, and particularly chapter 40B. I guess because this is state mandated, right? We would have a way to say no under 40B.
All right, we're gonna close discussion. Everybody on this board's talked. Anybody in the audience has a comment?
Not on Ken's comment or on Kristen's presentation? I have a question for Kristen. Is that what you're asking for?
I'm asking if for the subject we just talked about,
Oh,
if anybody in the audience wants to raise a comment.
Opinion, but it's not. So,
I could pretend I'm a judge and ask you to refer to me as Your Honor, but I'm not gonna do that.
well, Your Honor, thank you. Thanks for this, too. And so, I didn't realize how big this is, and getting my hands around it, the whole thing altogether is getting tougher all the time.
Yeah.
But this is helping, and so I really want to be sure I'm not misinformed by synthesizing several comments I heard together here tonight. My impression. Let me just give you the scenario. I live in the Great Pond, and that's first up at bat. In 2027, we have to have a permit application. And so, based on what Jonathan asked, that application will have to define the anticipated IAs in addition to the sewering that contribute to compliance in the Great Pond District.
Yes.
And so, and then someone said 20 years from when the permit is granted.
Yep.
Which won't be 27, it'll be something after 27.
They're granted pretty fast.
Yep.
For simplicity, though,
Assume
for simplicity,
27.
just assume it's 27 and take
Okay,
20 years.
and so then, I understand the sewers and how we develop the rationale and the planning and the funding and the implementation. But thinking of the IAs, it's like, you have point sources, as they say, all over town, and you're gonna be defining what those are. And so how is that what the discussion was here about how do we get those folks motivated to participate and?
That's the,
And
that's, of all the nuances and sticky points we have, we can say that we want to have 1,500 IAs in the Great Pond watershed. We have yet to figure out how to compel homeowners to do that. We've not figured that out.
But, for instance, in the health departments, we'll call it prototype with quasi-enforcement, they're saying, for instance, you might not be able to transfer title unless you met compliance.
They're wrestling with the lowest hanging fruit on the.
So you might have to wait for people
Yeah, they're wrestling with
to
it.
not be able to live in their house anymore. Okay.
They're wrestling with it.
Oh, this is neat. Oh, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Peter.
I'm looking to move the meeting along so we get out. But go ahead, what do you got?
I think this is related, and I think it's important, because it has to do with this and with the Board of Health. I haven't kept track of the latest version of the Board of Health thing, but when I was reading it carefully, one of the key issues was if you were in an area that was likely or planned or.
I'm actually going to cut you off, because
Okay.
you're getting into what the Board of Health is doing. We can have another discussion.
just saying
John's
it's
probably going
in our
John's probably going to
interest.
give an update.
To make sure.
Yeah, John's going to give an update.
Oh, okay, I'll wait for them.
John, and/or where their next meeting and how close they're getting to a hearing, okay? Thank you, sorry, just,
No, fair enough.
okay? Reports of members and staff. How are we doing monitoring down at Little Pond there, chief?
We're monitoring. Some of our apparatus was destroyed over the winter, so we are
You're replacing it.
currently
Okay.
fixing things.
Good. How are we doing in the Heights? People happy?
I'll try to be brief, but I got a couple of things I want to raise. One is just follow up on what Ken said. Unfortunately, in my walk by the pond yesterday, I noticed a small, probably 10-foot by 30-foot algae mat developing. Haven't seen one in several years, but right at the end of Grand Avenue, and where it is right at the pond and the stop sign, there is a little mat growing, and we have not seen that in several years. So I don't know, cold, wet spring, probably part of that. A lot of interesting stuff flowing into the pond from the ocean, but it is somewhat disconcerting. There is a couple of grants that Kristen has been working on the PRB for Snug Harbor, one of which we have the application in, and the award will be in early May. A second.
Knock on wood.
Well, the award will be, but we don't know if we're gonna get the award, but we have submitted the full
It did go,
proposal.
it did go in, yep.
And there is a second grant opportunity called the SNEP grants, and there is a letter of intent due on 4/18, which Kristen is submitting.
It's already in.
And,
She already
you know, that will be, May 19 is the day where they would say, hey, you've got a nice letter of intent, go ahead and submit a full proposal. If we cross that hurdle, then we would do a full proposal.
So I'm going to jump in. Kristen has put that together.
Yep.
And it's for 2 data loggers, which we've indicated.
Nope, different
No,
grant.
no.
You're talking the other, okay, sorry,
The other
sorry.
grant.
This is for the Snug Harbor PRB project.
Yeah, the secondary approach.
Second opportunity.
The second opportunity, and the two
Sorry.
granting authorities have said, yeah, you could submit this to both of us. And the undercurrent I read in their correspondence was, ooh, they like this project. So I'm cautiously optimistic on that. There is something else I want to mention briefly, and I think should be an agenda item possibly for our next meeting, that we talk about the information sessions for homeowners that are impacted by this next phase of sewer in Great Pond. Looking back historically, a couple of years before actual construction, the town started informational meetings. The first one was in March of 14 for the Little Pond folks. Town officials, wastewater, town engineering department, town manager, water quality management were key in representing to the residents what the hang was being planned. And there was a lot of unrest, there were some very heated meetings, there was probably 6 or 8 of them over a 1.5-year period. And you know, they started about a year and a half before construction began. So I think we're due now to start having those types of meetings with the affected homeowners, and whether it's this committee
Right.
and/or wastewater management and town
I'm
management.
taking your request to put it on the agenda, under
So that's
advisement.
the discussion.
I will talk with Amy about what
Yep.
DPW may or may not be
Be
planning,
happy to
and as
share.
appropriate, we'll add it to a future agenda. Okay?
A quickie. May election is the 20th. There's been a committee formed to advocate for the Phase 1 of the Great Pond Sewer connection. And donations would be accepted for buying signs if one would like to donate to those.
Who's the
And if-
treasurer, John?
Yeah, who do we give them to?
You just make checks out to the
Yeah,
committee
I-
to.
I'm gonna finish the paperwork tomorrow. John's gonna be the chair, I'll be the treasurer, okay? And I'll circulate something external of this meeting.
Okay.
To people that might be interested in participating with that project, okay? We jumped over you, Steve, but we've put an invite out to the test center to make themselves available at an upcoming meeting. Do we have a date, Kristen?
May 7th. May 7th,
So May
whatever that
7th.
first meeting is.
Whenever that meeting, yeah, next meeting. You know, a couple of comments were made on the town meeting floor about people didn't know where the test center was, what they were doing, and the status of things.
We had a meeting the other day, and I heard this.
Yeah, so we reached out and said,
Yeah.
you know, can you come in and tell us where you're at, so that, you know, where people know what's going on. So that'll be the next meeting.
I thought you said John was going to say something about the Board of Health.
I don't know. He can say whether the Board of Health has set up a hearing date or not yet.
They've been working very hard on getting the plastics regulation finished.
So they're finishing that
they've
first.
deferred, and it looks like they've eliminated their list down to just requiring IAs in new construction.
Okay. All I was going to say is, we owe it to them and to the town to let them know as soon as possible and as accurately as possible what the sewer areas are, or else you'll have people that are required by the Board of Health to put in an IA, and then X years later, required to change, to throw it away and pay for a sewer. And that just strikes me as incredibly unfair.
Tom, shellfish.
I'm waiting to hear back from Chuck, because I'd like to combine the report with something about a near-term plan of his expansion.
So you think you're gonna come back in a future meeting and talk about,
That's what I'm planning. I'm gonna be in touch with him again. The last time he's
why
just
don't we
been.
pencil you in for the second
Second
meeting
in May? What's
Okay.
that date, Kristen?
He said the second meeting of May. So that would be the 21st,
Day after Election Day?
yeah.
All right.
Yeah, pencil that in. And Jonathan, I think we got an update from you on where we're at.
Good.
Well, good, everybody's keeping busy, things are moving along, and the one thing we didn't talk about is we did put a request in for, apparently the SNEP people said you could ask for capital items not to exceed 10,000, and Kristen put together a grant request, working through Amy to get a couple of data loggers that can go into Perch Pond as we march forward on the Great Pond cleanup, and we can measure dissolved oxygen, salinity, and temperature, I believe.
I also put in Ken's suggestion for the par meter.
And, yeah, so,
Oh, nice, good.
you know, I would say we probably have a pretty strong probability on that one, because A, it was really targeted to capital items under $10,000, and these are two devices that have some value. The SON thing or whatever, that broke the $10,000 barrier, so we stepped back and decided to go.
Right, I knew you couldn't do
Just,
the big
those
sign.
are all paying attention, because you had suggested that once before, so.
Right. But we can do a lot of,
Okay. All right, that's the reports. We have minutes from a prior meeting. Read in detail by Tom, a couple of minor edits. Hopefully, everybody's had a chance to read their minutes. Any further revisions or comments on the minutes?
Yes. I don't usually do this. There's a sentence in there that Leighton and reports of members and staff reported on some crazy system using trucks. And
Yeah.
I just mentioned it FYI. I want to make it clear that I don't think it's practical for anything we're doing here.
Do the minutes say that you think it's practical, or that you just mentioned?
No, we just took a very neutral approach. Kept it, right, Christian?
I mean, I almost intended it as a joke,
Central collection of waste.
but it's okay if you leave it in there.
Say it after we adjourn.
Is it okay if I can go back and put a smiley face emoticon at the end?
Dump it into a big pit.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna move that what Kristen and I presented be accepted as presented.
Okay,
Second.
got a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Was I absent? I think I might have been absent.
Yeah, you were
Yeah,
dying.
you're sick,
Right, so
so you
I
abstain.
abstain.
There you go.
That's why I didn't know about the trucks.
All right,
Motion to adjourn.
no debate allowed on the motion to adjourn. Can I get a second?
No,
Second.
we're having too much fun.
All right. We're gonna sit here until somebody seconds it.
I said second.
I'm joking.
Yeah.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.